Grand Duchess Elizabeth Romanov Society. I'd like to welcome you all here tonight, especially our distinguished guests, Metropolitan Kallistos and Bishop Irenei. I'll say something more about them, but I just wanted to include them in that beginning. And I'd like, because otherwise it may be forgotten, to thank Paul Oxborough and Alexander Groves for the hospitality of their wonderful house to host the event. So thank you very much to them. I'm not going to say anything about the society because, well, firstly, we're rather pressed for time, and secondly, there are leaflets in the hall. For those of you who don't know about the society and would like to know more, you can pick up one of those and it will tell you everything. And also our next event, which is on every seat. So I won't say anything about that either. I'll just mention the fact that we had, this is the first time we've had a talk organised by the Society, but we have had some very grand recent events, including the unveiling of the monument to the Royal Martyrs and the Grand Duchess Elizabeth on the Isle of Wight. It's the only large public monument to them in the whole country, so this was quite an important event. And it's a very lovely monument. If you're ever in that part of the world, you should see it. They now light it up at night even, so they're very proud of it down there, and we're very proud of it as a society. So I just thought I'd get that in, but for the rest you can... So as I say, this will be the first time the Society has arranged a talk, but we hope it will be the first of many such. We haven't decided on the intervals yet, but perhaps 3 monthly intervals. They will be on the theme of, they'll be on an Orthodox theme, but connected in some way, either implicitly or explicitly, with the Grand Duchess and the Royal Martyred family. Maybe not exactly, but in some way connected, as is, I think, tonight's. I would like to introduce, I'm not going to introduce His Eminence Metropolitan Kallistos because Bishop Irenei will do this after I've finished. I'll say a few words about Bishop Irenei, who is actually the patron of our society. So we're very pleased to see him down here. We greet him very warmly. He is the Bishop of London and Western Europe for the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, appointed a year ago to this. He has been a bishop since 2016, yes? 2016. I could read a great long, lot of stuff about him. He's a man of many parts and jobs and so on. He is Synodal Secretary for Inter-Orthodox Relations for the Russian Church outside Russia. He is, I'm just picking out the more important jobs he has, hats he wears. He is a member of the Synodal Biblical and Theological Commission of the Moscow Patriarchate. He served 7 years as Archimandrite at St. Tikhon's Church in San Francisco, which was formerly the home and orphanage established by the great Saint John Maximovich of Shanghai, Brussels and San Francisco. He's a professor of theology who has focused on the theology and spirituality of the early church fathers, and of course that includes his own saint, the martyred Bishop Irenei of Lyon, who, interestingly enough, rather like some of the saints we commemorate in our society, links East and West. He was a Western saint, but wrote in Greek. So I think that's quite an interesting parallel there. So I'm not going to, have I missed anything out here, dear? You will tell me. I don't want to go on very further because time is a bit pressing. So I'm going to hand over to Bishop Irenei and hope that you can enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you, John. It's a joy to be here in the presence of my teacher of some years and mentor of many. And of course, the only thing of real significance that needs to be said about my background here today, and the one thing that was not mentioned, is that I am a student of Metropolitan Kallistos. And since you mentioned Irenaeus, it brings an opportunity to just say I was in Lyon last week to visit. We have a parish there, and I went for the first time to visit the grave of Saint Irenei. There are a few small relics. The tomb is now empty, as most of the relics there and of the martyrs of Lyon were during the French Revolution. The relics were intermingled with bones of criminals and so on, a familiar story. There is a great pile of remains in the crypt now. It's not possible to identify specifically whose relics are whose. But the tomb certainly held the relics for the sarcophagus for many centuries. And we celebrated in this crypt church the liturgy. And I was in a quiet moment before the liturgy began. I remembered very vividly the first time I ever read the writings of St. Irenaeus. It was in the one of the reading rooms of the Bodleian Library in Oxford. I was an undergraduate studying with then Bishop Kallistos, now Metropolitan, and he had assigned me to read St. Irenaeus, whom I had never read before. And I went and I found an English translation of most of his works, and I sat down in the library, and I remember that I had to be, forcibly is overselling it, but I had to be kicked out of the Bodleian at closing time because I simply stayed tucked away in my little corner, totally engrossed by these writings. And I remember very vividly saying to myself, I could spend my life reading this. And in some very real sense, through the encouragement of Bishop Kallistos and my own studies, I did precisely that. So it's an honor to remember these moments and to be here to introduce our speaker for the evening as we initiate this series of talks. I'm very delighted that we're doing so here in this region of the country where we have various missionary activities of the Church going on, and anything that we can do to contribute to the Orthodox life in this part of the island is a great joy. Metropolitan Kallistos is notable for his many years of service as the Spalding Lecturer in Eastern Christian Studies at the University of Oxford. He is well known beyond the circle of his vast number of students over many years. It's hard to go anywhere in the Orthodox world, in any country or in any linguistic background, and not find someone who has studied with Bishop Kallistos. I often point out to people when they suggest that it's something very unique that I studied with him. I said, well, I and the rest of the Orthodox world are the students of Bishop Kallistos. But quite beyond just the number of students at the university, he has been known for many years for his writings for the Orthodox Church, the Orthodox Way, and perhaps most significantly for many people, the 5-volume Philokalia, a project that spanned many decades of labor and has just recently come to its completion, to the great happiness of so many people across the English-speaking world. Bishop Kallistos, Metropolitan Kallistos, is a scholar of the Fathers, I would say, first and foremost, who can define scholarship in so many ways: patristic studies, historical studies, liturgical studies. But I always think of you, Vladika, as a student of the Fathers. It's from you that I learned to love them, to listen to what they have to say, and to let their voice influence how we think and the shape of our belief in our modern world. And in this category of scholarship, there are very few people in the world who are genuine students of the Fathers. We have many experts on the Fathers, many people who believe that they know exactly what the Fathers have to say about everything. but we have very few students of the Fathers, people who want to hear them speak and convey their voice to those who will listen. And it's to this great task that Metropolitan Kallistos has dedicated his work and his life. It's a privilege to have him here to open this series and to speak with us on a theme that combines so many of these subjects, the Eucharist as sacrifice. Please will you join me in welcoming Metropolitan Kallistos.
Thank you, Radhika, for those kind words. This is the final mystery, and beyond this it is not possible to go. Those are words of the 14th century Byzantine liturgist, St. Nicholas Kavasilas, speaking of the Eucharist. Taking the phrase Catholic tradition in a broad sense, to include Roman Catholics, Orthodox, High Church Anglicans, yes, and even High Church Methodists, we surely find that we agree on two things concerning the Eucharist. First, we affirm that the elements in the Eucharist, through consecration, become the true body and blood of Christ. And secondly, we affirm that the Eucharist is a sacrifice. Now, as regards the first of these affirmations, concerning the real presence, it is surely clear what we are concerned to say. As the Seventh Ecumenical Council put it, the consecrated elements are we claiming concerning the Eucharist when we speak of it as sacrificial. What indeed do we mean by sacrifice? And if the Eucharist is a sacrifice, what is the relation of the sacrifice of the Eucharist to the sacrifice of Christ on the cross? What do we mean by Eucharist? Most people have a very diminished idea of what Eucharist signifies. They think that it means what sacrifice signifies. They think that it means giving up. I'm going to make a great sacrifice this Lent. I shall give up having a second glass of sherry before dinner. But surely that is not the full meaning of sacrifice. Yes, in sacrifice, in principle, we find three elements, three stages: offering, consecration, communion. Now, that is not true of all sacrifices in the Bible. In the Old Testament, there are a great variety of many different sacrifices. But in principle, the basic notion of sacrifice embraces those three stages. First, offering. We offer something to God. In the Old Testament, it might be the first fruits of the earth, wheat, or it might be an animal. Secondly, by offering this object to God, we transfer it from the secular sphere to the religious sphere. We consecrate it. It becomes holy. And then, thirdly, we have communion together from the elements that we have offered and consecrated. Now, yes, in the sin offerings of the Old Testament, there is no communion at the end. They are whole burnt offerings. Everything is offered to God when the sacrifice is burnt. And of course, there are some unusual sacrifices in the Old Testament. There is, for example, the sacrifice of the scapegoat, who is not offered to God, but is made over to the evil one, driven out into the wilderness bearing the sins of the people. But basically, the Old Testament idea of sacrifice has these three elements: offering, consecration, and communion. And we can apply this to the Divine Liturgy. Exactly, there again, there is the same threefold pattern. So let's look more closely. In the Eucharist, who offers what to whom? Who offers? Here it helps us to think of the word liturgy. Often people explain the word liturgy as meaning ergon tou laou, the work of the people. That is dubious etymology, but sound theology. The Eucharist, we say, is a corporate, shared action, something done by many persons in common that cannot be done by any one of us alone. In the liturgy, moreover, as a corporate action, there are no spectators, only active participants. So, thinking of the liturgy, we say we offer, and that means all of us together. I would not be very happy if one said that the priest offers the sacrifice on behalf of the people. I think that is doubtful theologically and unhelpful spiritually. We offer, all of us together. It's interesting, thinking of this word we, to notice how in the Lord's Prayer the word us occurs 5 times, the word our occurs 3 times, we occurs, I think, once, but never in the Lord's Prayer do we say me, my, mine, or I. What applies to the Lord's Prayer applies also to the liturgy. The liturgical word is not I, but we. Yes, there are rare occasions in the Orthodox liturgy where the word I occurs. For example, at the beginning of the Creed we say, I believe. That is because the Creed was introduced into the Eucharist from the baptismal service. Naturally enough, the candidate at baptism, or the godparent speaking on his or her behalf, expressing his confession of faith, begins with the word I. Actually, the Creed as devised by the ecumenical councils began with the word we, and I would be very happy if the Orthodox would start saying we believe. But changes do not happen very easily in the Christian East. Another place in the Divine Liturgy where the word I is found, in the Russian Rite, is immediately before communion. Holding the chalice in his hand, the celebrant says, I believe and I confess that thou art of a truth the Christ, the Son of the living God, who camest into the world to save sinners. Again, I believe that this is indeed thine own pure body, and this is indeed thine own precious blood. But in this case, the prayers said aloud by the celebrant before the communion of the people actually belong to the service of preparation before Holy Communion. And so naturally, when you are at home saying the prayers by yourself in preparation for receiving communion, you use the word I. So that is again an exception that is not really an exception. So the liturgy is being offered by all of us. We offer. The sacrifice is shared by everyone. I like to think here of an anecdote included by Fyodor Dostoevsky in his last work, The Brothers Karamazov. This is my all-purpose anecdote. It can come into almost any talk. He didn't actually make the story up. He heard it in a village and he included it in his novel. Once upon a time, there was an old lady and she died. Much to her surprise, she found herself in a lake of fire. And looking out, she saw her guardian angel walking on the bank. So she said, "There's been some mistake. I'm a very respectable old lady, and I should not have been put here in this lake of fire." "Oh," said the angel, "do you ever remember doing something kind to someone else?" She thought for some time, and then she said, "Yes. I remember once I was gardening, and a beggar came by, and I gave her an onion." "Excellent," said the angel, reaching into his robes. "I happen to have that very onion with me now. Let us see what we can do with it." So she took one end of the onion, the angel took the other, and he began to pull her out of the lake of fire. I wonder whether it may not have been a shallot rather than an onion, but let that pass. She was, however, not the only person in the lake of fire, and when the others saw what was happening, they crowded round her and hung on to her in the hope of being pulled out as well. This did not please her at all. She began to kick and shout, "Let go, let go. It's not you who's being pulled out, it's me. It's not your onion, it's mine." And when she said, "It's mine," the onion snapped in two, and she fell back into the lake of fire. And there, so I'm told, she still is. Now that is Dostoevsky's story. And I would like to add this. What a pity that the old woman did not say, "It's our onion." Would it not have been strong enough in that case to pull all of them out of the lake of fire? But in saying, "It's mine, it's not yours," she was denying her true Christian identity. So that's the first point about the offering in the liturgy. We means all of us. And of course it doesn't mean only the visible congregation. It includes the whole church worshipping with us at every celebration of the Divine Liturgy. The saints are participating, the angels, the Mother of God, Christ himself. All are taking part in this act of offering. What then do we offer? We are the gifts of the earth back to God, but in a form that is transformed and transfigured. So the offering in the liturgy expresses something very important about our human nature. We do not just live in the world, but we transfigure the world. We change the world and consciously offer the world back to God. Yes, to a limited degree, the animals change their environment. Bees build honeycombs, beavers make dams, but the degree to which the animals change the environment is limited. They do it by instinct, but we can do it consciously and deliberately. I thought of this once when I was travelling through a village in France, and I went into a shop, and a bottle caught my eye with a squirrel on it, and it was a liqueur made out of nuts, and I bought the bottle. And then I thought to myself, is this not very significant? Squirrels gather nuts, they hide their nuts, they forget where they put them, they quarrel with other squirrels about their nuts. But there is one thing that squirrels don't do with nuts, and only humans can do. Squirrels don't make a liqueur out of nuts. Actually, the liqueur was rather nasty. So yes, we humans, made in the image of God, have the power to offer back to God the fruits of the earth, transformed by human hands. But then, let us come to another point. We offer bread and wine to God, but with the offering of the Eucharist, we also offer ourselves. And that's the real offering in the Eucharist. With the fruits of the earth that we bring to Christ, that we bring to the altar, we are offering symbolically ourselves as well. We may think here of what is said in Psalm 40. Sacrifice and burnt offering you have not desired. Then I said, behold, I come to do thy will, O Lord. The real offering is not an object, but ourselves. The text that I have just quoted from the Psalms is again used in the Epistle to the Hebrews, which is, of course, fundamental if we want to understand the Eucharist as a sacrifice. But there is another layer of meaning that we have to bring in here. We offer, all of us, but the fundamental and primordial offerer is Christ himself. We offer, but Christ offers himself in the Eucharist. Our offering of bread and wine is taken up into the offering of Christ. If we want to understand the nature of the Eucharist as a sacrifice, we need to hold fast to this particular idea, that the true celebrant, the true priest, in every Eucharistic celebration is Christ. We, priest and people together, are only con-celebrants with him. In the Orthodox liturgy, right at the beginning of the service, before the opening blessing, the deacon says to the priest, "It is time for the Lord to act." That is a quotation from Psalm 119, verse 126. It's often mistranslated in editions in English of the liturgy, but this, I think, is the best translation. It is time for the Lord to act. Not it is time for us to do something, but it's time for Christ himself to act. So the Eucharist is not just words, but an action. And in this action, the primary actor is Christ himself. The liturgy is the action of the people, yes, but more fundamentally, it is the action of the Lord. That is said yet more clearly later in the course of the liturgy. During the singing of the hymn of the cherubim, just before the great entrance, the solemn entrance with the holy gifts, the priest says to Christ, "You are the one who offers and the one who is offered. Sii, o prosperon, και ο προσφερόμενος. Christ is the offerer, but he is also the offering. Who offers in the liturgy? Christ. What is offered in the liturgy? Christ himself. The same point about the presence of Christ in the liturgy is stressed in the exchange of the kiss of peace immediately before the creed. In current Orthodox usage, it's only the celebrating clergy who exchange the kiss of peace, but it would be much better if we could do it with all the members of the congregation taking part as well. And this happens in the Western churches and in some Orthodox parishes. In the Orthodox use, as the clergy exchange the kiss of peace, they say, Christ is in our midst. And then they reply, he is and shall be. So here is another primary point about the liturgy. The true celebrant is Christ. It is Christ who offers, and he offers himself in the liturgy. We might ask then, to whom is the Eucharistic offering made? This was discussed by two councils held in 12th century Constantinople in the years 1156 and 1157. And they stated that the offering is made to the Holy Trinity. Some people might think that the more obvious answer would be that the sacrifice of the Mass is Christ offering himself to the Father. And that is true, but it's not the whole truth. The Trinity cannot be divided or separated. All three persons are always united, and therefore the offering is not made just to the Father alone, but to all three persons of the Godhead together. This idea also comes in the Western Mass. There's a prayer, for example, that begins, Receive Holy Trinity, Suscipe Sancta Trinitas, Hanc oblationem. This is the point where East and West agree, but it's probably more emphasized in Orthodoxy than in the West. So we begin to get an answer to our question. Who offers what to whom? We offer bread and wine, a symbol of ourselves. We offer ourselves. But then secondly, we offer Christ. And Christ offers himself to the Holy Trinity. Christ offers himself to himself because he is one of the Holy Trinity. So we've got an answer to who offers what to whom, or the beginnings of an answer. And that brings us to the question, what is the relation of the Eucharistic sacrifice to the sacrifice of Christ on the cross? And here I turn again to the councils of Constantinople in the mid-12th century, which have been very little studied, and that's a great pity. The council said, first of all, the Eucharist is not a new sacrifice. The sacrifice of Christ is one perfect and sufficient sacrifice. We cannot add to the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. So we are not to think of the Eucharist as, in some way, a new sacrifice supplementing the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. Equally, the councils in the 12th century said that the Eucharist is not a repetition of the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. Christ suffered once for all, and his sacrificial death on the cross may be recalled, but it cannot be repeated. One of the key words in the Epistle to the Hebrews is ef hapax, once for all. Christ died once for all on the cross. We cannot repeat the action of the cross. But then the councils of Constantinople added, the Eucharist is not just a bare memorial of the sacrifice, it is a real sacrifice in itself. This is because one of the deacons in the great church of Constantinople, Sotirikos Pantevgenos, argued that since Christ died once for all on the cross, the sacrifice in the Eucharist is not a real sacrifice, it is just a memorial, a remembrance of the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. That was the opinion, of course, of the reformers in the 16th century, but it's anticipated in this way in Constantinople in the 12th century. So Sotirikos said that the Eucharist represents the sacrifice of Christ only in an imaginary, or rather in an iconic way. Fantastikos, imalon ikonikos. The councils of Constantinople in the mid-12th century rejected this. They said it is a real sacrifice. But if it is a real sacrifice, not just a bare memorial of the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, and if it is neither an addition to the sacrifice on the cross, nor a repetition, how are we to understand the relation of the Eucharist to the sacrifice of Christ on the cross? The councils in the 12th century answered simply, the sacrifice of the Eucharist is identical with the sacrifice on the cross. There's an unchanged sacrifice, one and the same, they said. But they didn't try to explain how. So you may feel they merely restated the problem. They merely excluded certain false ways of thinking about the Eucharist. Here I recall a story told of Thomas Carlyle, that great Victorian. One day he came back from church in a bad temper, and he said to his mother, "I cannot think why they preach such long sermons. If I were a minister, I would go up into the pulpit and say no more than this: good people, you know what you ought to do. Now go and do it." And his mother replied to him, "Aye, Thomas, and would you tell them how? It's easy enough to tell people what to do, but can you tell them how?" And we might apply this to what I've been saying about the Eucharist as a sacrifice. If the sacrifice of the Eucharist is one and the same as the sacrifice on the cross, how is that possible? I don't think the answer of the 12th century councils of Constantinople would have been able to satisfy Carlyle's mother, but she's a difficult old lady. However, there is a theologian of the 12th century who wrote about this and sought to explain the relation of the sacrifice of the Mass to the sacrifice on the cross. And this is Nicholas of Bethoni. His writings are not in the Greek Patrology of Mean. When I wanted to read one of his works on the liturgy, I couldn't find it in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, so I had to go up to London to the British Library. I found the book I wanted there, published in 1863 in Leipzig, but I had to cut most of the pages. So there this book had reposed in the British Library for more than a century, and nobody had actually got round to reading it. In that way, we cannot say that Nicholas of Methoni is exactly a bestseller. But that's a pity. Now, central to his understanding of the relationship between the cross and the Eucharist is the idea of the heavenly altar. This is mentioned in the Divine Liturgy, in the litany after the consecration and before the communion. We pray that our God, who loves humankind, having accepted these mystical gifts on his holy and mystical altar above the heavens, may send down upon us his divine grace and the gift of the Holy Spirit. So there you have the altar above the heavens. And this was taken up by Nicholas. And he gives a broad interpretation of sacrifice. He doesn't limit it to the death of Christ on the cross. He thinks of sacrifice as extending through the whole ministry of Christ. So, Christ lives his life on earth through the incarnation. Then he dies on the cross. But his self-offering doesn't come to an end at that point. As the epistle to the Hebrews teaches us, Christ then passes beyond the veil and he enters the heavenly places. And there before the heavenly altar, he ever makes intercession for us. Hebrews 7:25. So this is the idea that Nicholas of Methoni took up. Christ's sacrifice on the cross, once for all as a historical event, continues in heaven, in eternity, when Christ continues to offer intercession, and in other words, to offer himself. So, the sacrifice of Christ as a historical event came to an end, but it passes into eternity, where it remains an unchanging element. And then Nicholas said, the Eucharist, the Divine Liturgy, wherever it is celebrated, is a showing forth of the continual self-offering of Christ at the heavenly altar. So you see there how Nicholas does not attempt to relate the death of Christ on the cross back in the 1st century and the celebration of the Eucharist in many different places now in the 21st century. He doesn't try to make a direct link between the two as events in history, but he relates the two of them to an event outside history, outside time, in eternity, the self-offering of Christ at the heavenly altar. Indeed, the heavenly altar is Christ himself offering himself. So, you relate the sacrifice of the cross to the continuing self-offering of Christ in eternity, in heaven. And then you relate the self-offering of Christ in heaven to the celebration of the Eucharist here on earth. The earthly liturgy is a sacrifice because it shows forth on earth and makes present the continuing sacrifice of Christ in heaven. Indeed, Christ does not just offer sacrifice, he is the sacrifice. Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. So if Christ is the sacrifice, then we can see a link between the real presence and the doctrine of the Eucharist as a sacrifice. To sum up, if you are still with me, some of you, who offers what to whom? First of all, we offer bread and wine to God. This is our equivalent to the offering of the first fruits in the Old Testament, the point emphasized by St. Irenaeus. But then we offer ourselves with the offering of bread and wine. That, however, is only the beginning. We have to extend that by saying Christ in the Eucharist offers himself. He is present in the liturgy as the true celebrant. Every time we look towards the altar, we should see him standing there, invisibly but in full reality. So then, we offer what Christ offers, and Christ offers himself, and he offers himself to the Holy Trinity. Our offering of bread and wine is taken up into Christ's self-offering, and so our offering of bread and wine becomes Christ's own body and blood. In this way, the Eucharist is truly a sacrifice. Well, will all of this satisfy Mrs. Carlyle? Perhaps not. But that should not disturb us too much. Let us remember the words of the great Russian saint and parish priest of the early 20th century, Father John of Kronstadt. He says, the Eucharist is a continual miracle. So I invite you this evening, reflecting upon the Eucharist as a sacrifice and as the real presence of Christ, to open your eyes anew and see this continual miracle. Thank you.
First to thank Metropolitan Kallistos for this wonderful talk on the theme, this Eucharistic theme, which is obviously central to our lives as Christian people. And through his explanation, we're able to see into this mystery a little more clearly. I remember when I was about to be ordained a deacon, a certain priest who may or may not be seated in this room gave me a small book to read, to prepare. And one of the things that the author of that book wrote was that the singular line that summarizes the whole of the priesthood is when the priest says in the liturgy, "Thine own of thine own we offer unto thee, O Lord, on behalf of all and for all." And I feel that that was explained very deeply in what you said this evening, Your Grace. I thank you very much for that. I believe you might be open to some questions.
Yes, I would be. I might just comment on what you said. On behalf of all and for all, the Greek there is not just in the masculine, but it's in the neuter. On behalf of all things and for all things. We do, of course, offer the liturgy on behalf of all persons, but we also offer the liturgy on behalf of the whole creation. So we could, developing this line of thought, consider the liturgy in its ecological dimensions as an offering and sanctification of the whole material creation, and indeed of the animals along with all humans. So the offering is pan-cosmic.
Perhaps in the same way that St. Mark, where St. Matthew says, "Go and preach the gospel unto all nations," St. Mark, "Go and preach the gospel unto all creatures."
Yes.
I've noticed that shift there. His Eminence will entertain questions if there are comments. Yes, please.
Yes, from there.
Vladika Kallistos, it is always a great pleasure and an inspiration to read all that you have written and to hear you speak. If I may, my memory was jogged by your reference to Mrs. Carlyle. All of us in this room, good, bad or indifferent, we're all orthodox. We're all faint but pursuing. But what you have spoken of today is something of which we have a little bit of knowledge. Maybe not as profound as yours. You have advanced our knowledge of that. But I wanted really to pick on the reference to Mrs. Carlyle regarding the non-Orthodox. In February of last year, I was invited to speak at St. Vladimir's seminary in the States to the seminarians and whoever the clergy was interested. And at some point, I said, without really thinking about it, we all have the great gift of orthodoxy, and we should share it with others. At the end, when there were questions and answers, a young seminarian, I think he was about 20, not more, he said to me, now you have said that we are gifted with orthodoxy. It's a great gift, and a great gift should be shared. How should we share it? And the kid had me there, because I said it without thinking further. Now, those of you who know St. Vladimir's seminary, it really is in the middle of nowhere. There's not a potential congregation there to be approached, to be preached to. They have had problems in recent years when the seminary has been attacked. Groups of Yobs throwing stones through the windows. And I said, now, I know that it's a weak response, but I can't think of a better one. I said, well, why don't you invite some of the people in the wider community who have farms, not right up again, and explain to them in simple terms what orthodoxy means. Not go into the complex theological explanations of the liturgy and so on. You have to have a common approach that will catch them. And I don't think, not that I've seen, that either in Russian or in English or in any other, maybe Greek, I don't know, that there is a simple explanation of all, sort of, the first steps one should take when explaining to someone who has no idea what Orthodox Christianity means. With so many distinguished clerics here at the moment, I would like some, and I think I'm not the only one, some guidance for when you're approached. What does your church mean? You have to have a preliminary answer at least. Yeah.
Yes. When people approach to me and say, what is orthodoxy? What does the Orthodox Church mean? I would encourage them, first of all, to go to the Divine Liturgy. I would explain to them that it is not possible for us to give communion to non-Orthodox, but I would encourage them to receive the Antitheron at the end of the liturgy, if that is the custom of the church where they go. And I would not urge them to start by reading a lot of books, but I would encourage them to have some experience of the Orthodox Church as a worshipping community. The reading of books can come later, but start with some idea of in what spirit do the Orthodox stand before God? What is their sense of the sacred? Now that reflects partly my own experience, because I was not brought up Orthodox. I first went into an Orthodox church when I was 17 years old. I've often told this story. And that was the Russian church, then in Buckingham Palace Road, and it was a Saturday evening, and the vigil service was in progress. And the first thing that struck me was, this church is empty, there are no pews here, just a large expanse of polished floor. Then I realized there were a few people in the church, standing near the walls, that there were lamps before the icons. After a bit, the deacon came out from behind the screen and intoned a litany. Somewhere out of sight there was a small choir singing. And then I had an overwhelming sense of not the church is empty, but the church is full of invisible worshippers. I had a feeling that we, this small visible congregation, were being taken up into an action far larger than ourselves, an action involving the departed, the saints, the Mother of God, Christ himself. I had a sense of heaven on earth. Much later on, I read the story of the conversion of Vladimir and how the Russian emissaries reported to him of their experience at the Divine Liturgy in the Church of the Holy Wisdom. How they said, we did not know whether we were in heaven or on earth. And I, with surprise, noted, yes, this was my experience too. So that's a good way to begin, if you can, by experiencing the worship of the Orthodox Church. But that's only the beginning, of course. We should read books, we should meet and talk with Orthodox people. And let us note that we shall never obtain an exhaustive knowledge of the Church and what it teaches. We are always only just beginning. St. Irenei says, even in the age to come, God will always have new things to teach us, and we shall always have new things to learn. I find that deeply encouraging. We shall never get to the point where we can say to God, you are repeating yourself, we have heard it all before. God will remain to all eternity a God of surprises. So we begin to understand a little about orthodoxy, but never the whole of it. And people will learn not only from what we say, but from what we are. Not just from our words, but from our lives, from our persons. And perhaps that is the most important thing about communicating orthodoxy to others.
Thank you, Monica.
Other questions for His Eminence?
Just a little replica. Our society is dedicated to the Holy Martyr Elizabeth.
Sorry, could you speak louder?
Our society is dedicated to the, Holy Martyr Grand Duchess Elizabeth, and the Holy Royal Martyrs of Russia also. We deal with them. We tell people about them. We are discovering new facts. We publish. We organize pilgrimages, and we think that all these activities also can bring people closer to Orthodoxy, because they will know better the personalities of these holy people who actually sacrifice themselves as holy martyrs, as also thousands, if not millions, of martyrs of Russia during the time of the revolution. Do you think that we are on the right way, that by discovering, by showing people the example, by making them interested, making them love these great persons, so this is a way also for them to discover Orthodoxy?
Yes, I truly believe that you are on the right way. I'm very much encouraged to learn about the Society of the Grand Duchess Elizabeth, St. Elizabeth the New Martyr, and we often learn from a personal example, not just from abstract ideas. Martyrdom is fundamental to the Christian life, but we learn what martyrdom means by learning about the lives of particular martyrs. And so I consider that you are doing valuable work in this society.
Thank you. Because our society is not openly directly Orthodox. It's not directly missionary, but we think that always we pray, and when we organize what we're doing. But,
well, I hope the work of the Society will extend far beyond simply the Orthodox and will draw others in and help them to learn about what happened 100 years ago in Russia. The example of the new martyrs of Russia, how many thousands of people suffered for their faith but remained faithful. That is something of significance, not just to a circle of Orthodox, but to the whole world. And it's good that we should make this known according to our abilities.
Other questions? Yes, please.
Levica Kallistos, thank you so much for your lecture. Regarding the sacrifice, bread and wine that is offered during the Eucharist is understandable, but we also offer ourselves. Do you mean our prayers and our repentance when we offer to the liturgy during the Holy Communion, before that and after? Is a changing of our ways of life and the prayers as well? What are your thoughts on that? Because you did mention that we offer ourselves. I would like you to expand just a little bit on that, what exactly we offer. And if you are referring to our prayers, repentance and changing of our ways of life, and one person, obviously without God's help, cannot do that, and we fail time after time after time to bring the offerings that we should be bringing as Christians to the Holy Communion. What is your reflection on that, on the failing part of our gifts to God when we come to the liturgy and the Holy Communion? Thank you.
Yes. On the first point you mentioned, I emphasized, and I just will repeat it now, that we offer in the Eucharist not a heap of grains of wheat, but bread, and not a bunch of grapes, but wine. So we offer back to God the fruits of the earth, but not in their original state, but as transformed by human hands. So by offering bread and wine, we are offering not just God's gifts back to himself, but God's gifts which we have used and changed. That this is our function in the world, not just to live in the world as the animals do, but to alter the world, to fill it with a deeper meaning. So that is the first way in which I see our offering of ourselves, because we have put part of ourselves into the bread and wine. Not perhaps each one of us individually and personally, but humans as a whole have put themselves into these gifts that we bring to God. We offer to God what is his own, but not in its original form, but endued with a new meaning. So that's the way in which I see we involve ourselves in the offering. That would be the basic connection that I would make.
Would you permit me to
Thank you.
offer a response? I want to thank you for something that has connected in my mind just tonight, hearing you speak about precisely this fact of offering not grain but bread, not grapes but wine. I've heard you make this point before, but tonight it really connected to one specific area of our self-offering. Pastorally, one of the questions I'm asked the most often by people about liturgical practice is simply, do I really have to say the prayers before I come to receive the Eucharist? We have, particularly in the Russian tradition, the habit of preparing the night before with special prayers, which, if they're done in fullness, can be very lengthy. And people are always asking if this is necessary, and if so, why? But just this evening, listening to you speak, the connection was made in my mind that this is how we offer ourselves as a different product. We don't simply arrive as we are to the liturgy, any more than we simply toss a bunch of grapes onto the altar. Just as it takes work to turn the grapes into wine, and we offer that fruit to God, so we have to do the same with our own selves, so that what we are presenting at the liturgy is not the ordinariness of our life, but a life that we have reshaped, even just by a small effort, to be something sacred and purposeful. So if I have not terribly misunderstood you, I find this to be a very helpful insight, and I wonder if you could tell me if I'm on the right track, or if I have gone horribly amiss.
You are exactly on the right track.
Thank God.
So I commend you for putting it in that way. One person who emphasizes this theme of we offer ourselves is St. Augustine. And he says, among other things, there you are on the altar, there you are in the chalice. So he sees the offerings of bread and wine as embodying us, ourselves, and therefore it is we who are being consecrated in the consecration of the liturgy. And one moment when the link between our self-offering and the offering of Christ is particularly emphasized is when, just after the communion of the people, the priest takes the paten, and on the paten are all the little particles of bread which have been taken out during the preparation as the priest commemorates the many names that are sent up to him. So that these little particles of bread resting on the paten, these symbolize all the different people who have offered and who ask that the offering should be made for their friends and relatives as well. All these particles, and he puts them in the chalice and says, wash away, Lord, the sins of all those here remembered with thy most precious blood. Some people do this before the communion of the people, but I think the more correct practice is to give communion only from the lamb and then put all the particles in the chalice. But the particles symbolize all the different persons, and the act of putting those particles in the consecrated blood of Christ in the chalice shows how we are united, our self-offering with Christ's self-offering. It's an important moment which, of course, since it's usually said silently by the priest, people are not aware of it. But there are depths in the liturgy which we have to find only by exploring.
Thank you so much. Alexander, I think, is the last question.
You talk, Father, about how mankind takes the created order and transforms it as part of the offering. It always seems to me that the Orthodox vision of beauty, it that's used in liturgy is so wonderful, and that contrasts with what humanity so often does with the creative order, which seems to be to mess it up, to destroy our world and endanger it. And I think the Orthodox Church perhaps has something very unique to say about that. Would you have anything to?
Yes, I remember what was said in the account of the conversion of Russia in the Russian Primary Chronicle, which I've already referred to, when Prince Vladimir sent his emissaries to the different countries of the world to try and discover what is the true faith, and how when they came to Constantinople and went to the Divine Liturgy in the Cathedral of the Holy Wisdom, they felt they had found what they were looking for. And when they came back to Vladimir, they said, yes, we knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth. And then they added, we can never forget that beauty. So in that story, the beauty of our faith and the beauty of our liturgy is emphasized very clearly. Not necessarily an aesthetic beauty. Sometimes the liturgy is celebrated under very humble circumstances in some temporary building with a not very good choir, but it is still heaven on earth, and the spiritual beauty is still there for those who have eyes to see.
In just a moment, I'm going to ask John to just say a word about what's coming next with the Society as we finish for the evening. But I want to thank once again our speaker for this opening discussion, His Eminence Metropolitan Kallistos. I said at the beginning, and it was intended as the highest possible praise, that we have in your grace a genuine student of the Fathers. Someone, we heard in his talk today, I lost count, 6 or 7 different fathers of the church and councils cited for us, someone who speaks their voice to us so that we can learn from them as well as from your own perspectives. And if I can just add that you mentioned in St. Irenaeus' comment that with God we will always have something still to learn even in eternity. I'm very happy to say that even for those of us who have been coming to listen to you speak for many years, even here in this life, we always find something new to learn. And I thank you for that gift that you give us. Please would you join me in thanking once more.
Thank you for inviting me, and I wish you well for all the program of your society.